4 days. That is how long the men of the 101st Airborne Division had been cut off inside the Belgian town of Bastogne when the German army sent 4 officers under a white flag to deliver a surrender demand. The message gave the Americans 2 hours to comply or face total annihilation. The acting commander of the 101st, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the demand once, set it down, and wrote back a single word. The German translator who received the reply had to ask what it meant. It meant no. And 40 miles to the south, the man who would make that answer stick had already been moving for 2 days. We're going to tell you everything about this today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start at the beginning, and then we'll move from there. This was not supposed to happen like this. By December of 1944, the senior Allied commanders believed the German army in the West was broken. 6 months after D-Day, France and Belgium had been liberated. Allied forces had entered Germany at several points. Intelligence assessments suggested the war could be over before spring. The German army was in retreat, outgunned, short on fuel, short on replacements, and losing an average of several thousand men a day along a front that stretched from the Dutch coast to the Swiss border. That assessment was wrong in a very specific way. Hitler had been planning the offensive since September. His generals, almost unanimously, had told him it was beyond Germany's remaining capacity. The fuel was not there. The replacements were not there. The air cover was not there. Hitler dismissed their objections. He called the plan Watch on the Rhine, and he personally supervised its development with a secrecy so strict that most frontline German commanders did not know what was coming until days before the attack. The element of surprise was his only real asset, and he used it completely. On December 16, 1944, 3 German armies, totaling more than 250,000 men and 1,400 armored vehicles, struck a lightly held stretch of American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack came through terrain that Allied planners had judged too dense for major armored operations. That was precisely why the Germans had chosen it. The plan was to split the Allied line, seize the port of Antwerp, and cut off the British and Canadian armies from their supply base. If it worked, Germany could negotiate a peace on the Western Front and turn everything east to face the Soviets. It was a desperate plan. It came closer to succeeding than almost anyone wanted to admit afterward. The American units in the Ardennes on December 16th were either resting after hard fighting elsewhere, or were Green divisions getting their first exposure to the front. They were overwhelmed inside hours. 2 entire divisions were effectively destroyed in the first days of the offensive. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in the Belgian Ardennes where 7 major roads converged, suddenly became the hinge on which the entire battle might turn. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of every German armored column trying to push west. The Germans needed it. The Americans could not afford to give it up. The nearest available American unit was the 101st Airborne Division, currently resting and refitting near Reims after the failure of Operation Market Garden in Holland. The division had been in combat almost continuously since June. The men were exhausted. They had no winter gear. Many were still wearing summer uniforms. Their equipment needed maintenance. Their medical supplies were low. None of that mattered. On the night of December 18th and into December 19th, the 101st climbed into open trucks in the dark and cold and drove north toward the sound of the guns. They arrived in Bastogne just ahead of the German encirclement. Acting Division Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe established his command post in a barracks building on the edge of town. He had about 18,000 American soldiers under his command, a mix of the 101st and various attached units that had fallen back into Bastogne ahead of the German advance. By December 20th, German forces had closed the ring around the town. There was no road in or out that American vehicles could use. There was no way to bring in supplies. The fog that had settled over the Ardennes was so thick that air resupply was impossible. The men already inside the perimeter were what McAuliffe had to work with. What he had was not a lot. His men were sharing ammunition between companies. Artillery batteries were rationing shells because the supply trucks that should have restocked them had been cut off before the encirclement completed. Medical supplies were running short enough that the division surgeon was performing surgery with inadequate anesthesia on wounded men in a building that German artillery hit twice. The temperature at night was dropping toward -20 Fahrenheit. The men in the foxholes surrounding Bastogne had blankets and inadequate coats, and the training to understand that if they lost this position, they were likely not going to be taken prisoner. The Germans in those days were not consistently taking prisoners. Inside the perimeter, the men knew roughly what the situation was. McAuliffe did not hide it from them. His order of the day on December 22nd, the same day the German surrender demand arrived, told the men of the 101st that they were surrounded. He told them the enemy was in for a surprise. He told them to celebrate the fact that they had been chosen to make this stand. The paratroopers who read the order that morning, hungry and cold in their foxholes, responded to it about the way experienced soldiers respond to official optimism. They kept their heads down and they kept their weapons clean. Private First Class Isidore Jackman of B Company, 513th Parachute Infantry, was in the line on December 26th when two German tanks broke through near the village of Flamierge and began firing into American positions. Jackman left his covered position and walked toward the tanks under direct fire, drawing their attention while his unit repositioned. He was hit multiple times. He did not stop moving until the attack was broken. He was killed in that action and received the Medal of Honor posthumously. He was 22 years old. He had been in Europe for 4 months. The German commander who had encircled Bastogne was General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps. He had the town surrounded by 3 full divisions and a 4th in reserve. His orders were to take Bastogne quickly and push west. He had the men to do it on paper. What he did not have were soldiers who had encountered the 101st Airborne before, and he had not anticipated what it would mean to try to break a perimeter defended by men who had been trained to hold positions under conditions that would have ended most units. Every day the garrison held was a day his columns could not move freely along the roads he needed. He calculated, correctly, that the Americans inside were in a deteriorating position. He calculated, incorrectly, that this meant they were ready to break. The food situation was straightforward. By December 22nd, the men of the 101st had been on short rations for 4 days. Half rations, then less. The field kitchens had run out of most supplies. Men were eating whatever they had carried in themselves, sharing K rations that were supposed to feed 1 soldier among 2 or 3. Some units had nothing at all. The men were cold, hungry, low on ammunition, and surrounded. Their orders were to hold. On December 22nd, 4 German officers appeared at the American perimeter under a white flag. They were carrying a formal written demand. It was addressed to the American commander, and it informed him that his position was hopeless, that German forces surrounding him were sufficient to destroy the garrison, and that he had 2 hours to surrender. The alternative, the document said, was total annihilation. McAuliffe read it. His initial reaction, by the accounts of the officers present, was a single word. He used it to express his contempt for the demand. His staff told him he should put something in writing. He asked what he had said when he first read the demand. They told him. He said that was good enough, and he wrote it down. The reply delivered to the German officers was a single typed word: nuts. Colonel Joseph Harper, who handed it to the German commanders, told them it meant, go to hell. The German officers were confused. They asked if the reply was affirmative or negative. Harper told them to figure it out. They went back to their lines. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. 3 days earlier, on December 19th, a meeting had taken place in a cold, damp room in the French city of Verdun. Eisenhower had assembled his senior commanders to assess the crisis. The mood in the room was grim. The German advance had torn a hole in the Allied line 60 miles wide and was still moving. The question was, what to do about it. Eisenhower went around the room, asking what each commander could do and when. When he reached General George Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south of the breakthrough, Patton said he could attack north into the German flank within 48 hours with 3 divisions. The room went quiet. Then several of the officers laughed. Not at Patton exactly, but at the idea. Moving a major army group 90 degrees in winter conditions, in freezing fog, over iced roads, in the middle of an active battle, in 48 hours, was considered operationally impossible. The logistics alone should have required a week of planning and preparation. Patton was not guessing. Before he walked into the Verdun meeting, he had ordered his staff to prepare 3 separate contingency plans for a northward attack. He had been watching the German buildup in the Ardennes for weeks and had anticipated that a call might come. His operations officer had spent the previous night issuing preliminary movement orders to division commanders. When Patton said 48 hours, he meant it in the most literal possible sense. The preparations were already in motion before he sat down in that room. What Patton's staff accomplished in those 48 hours was something the Army's own doctrine said could not be done on that timeline. Moving a major formation 90 degrees required rewriting hundreds of road movement orders, rerouting supply convoys, repositioning artillery units, reassigning air support coordination channels, and notifying corps and division commanders of the new axis of attack, all while the units themselves were either in contact with the enemy or moving through conditions that made normal communication unreliable. The telephone lines were cut in multiple places by German action. Radio communication was intermittent because of the terrain and the weather. Patton's staff officers drove the roads personally, stopping unit commanders to deliver orders by hand when other methods failed. Eisenhower approved. He told Patton that if he actually attacked by December 22nd, it would be one of the finest movements in the history of the war. Patton thanked him and left the meeting. His chief of staff was already on the phone to 3rd Army headquarters before Patton's car pulled away from the building. He attacked on December 22nd. What happened over the following 96 hours was one of the most demanding logistical operations the American Army conducted in the entire war. More than 133,000 vehicles moved north or northeast over roads that were glazed with ice, clogged with retreating units, and periodically hit by German aircraft and artillery. The columns stretched for miles. Vehicles broke down and had to be pushed off the road. Men marching on the shoulders of the roads slipped and fell in the dark. In some places, the temperature was cold enough to freeze the fuel lines of vehicles that sat still for more than a few minutes. Patton drove with the leading elements in an open jeep. He made it a point not to put a roof over himself when his men were exposed to the same weather. He drove up and down the column, checking movement rates, demanding updates, pushing units that had slowed. He prayed before the attack, specifically requesting that God provide better weather. He composed a prayer and had it printed and distributed to the 250,000 men under his command. The prayer asked for clear skies so his men could fight. The weather did not clear for the ground forces immediately. On December 23rd, it did clear enough for air resupply to begin, and C-47 transport aircraft dropped ammunition and medical supplies into the Bastogne perimeter for the first time since the encirclement. The men who watched those planes come in, low and slow over the town, later said it was the first moment they allowed themselves to believe they might actually survive. It did not matter that the corridor was not open yet. It did not matter that German units were still pressing the perimeter. The planes meant someone knew they were there. The German forces between the 3rd Army and Bastogne were not simply in position. They were actively trying to push the American lines back south while simultaneously maintaining the encirclement to the north. The 4th Armored was attacking into the flank of formations that were themselves attacking. The fighting was continuous, and it went at night as well as during the day, which in December in the Ardennes meant fighting in temperatures that dropped far below freezing in near-complete darkness. Tank crews who stopped their vehicles for more than an hour risked having their engines freeze. Men who stopped moving risked frostbite severe enough to end their ability to fight. The 4th Armored Division, the spearhead unit tasked with reaching Bastogne, fought through 7 days of continuous combat to cover 40 miles of German-held territory. The division had been in action almost without pause since the Lorraine campaign in September. Their tank crews were operating on minimal sleep, running vehicles that had not been properly maintained in weeks, fighting in terrain that favored the defender. They lost vehicles every day. They kept moving. The breakthrough came on December 26th. A task force from the 37th Tank Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the same officer who had led the armor at the Battle of Aricourt 3 months earlier, found a gap in the German line near the village of Bastogne. Abrams called in artillery on both sides of the corridor and sent his tanks and infantry through at speed. They took casualties crossing the gap. They kept moving. At 4:45 in the afternoon on December 26th, the lead Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored broke through the German perimeter south of Bastogne and made contact with the 101st Airborne. The corridor the tanks came through was barely 2 miles wide and under fire from both sides. Men were killed crossing it in both directions throughout that first night. The relief was real, but it was not safe. It would take several more days before the corridor was wide enough to bring in supplies in volume. The men who came out to meet those tanks had been inside the perimeter for 8 days. The men who had arrived with the 101st on December 19th had been without adequate food for most of that time. They were gaunt in the faces. Some were frostbitten. They were wrapped in anything they had been able to find, field jackets and blankets and strips of burlap. When the first tank commander stood up in his hatch and identified himself, some of the paratroopers who had been in the foxholes longest did not react immediately. Some of them had not believed it was actually happening. Patton wrote in his diary that evening that it was probably the greatest achievement his army had accomplished. He was not given to excessive praise of his own work, and he was not wrong about this. In a week of continuous movement through winter combat, the Third Army had covered 40 miles of contested ground, reached a surrounded garrison on the edge of collapse, and broken the southern jaw of the German encirclement. The battle for Bastogne itself would continue for several more weeks. The men already there would keep fighting, but the crisis was over. The battle itself did not end on December 26th. The corridor Abrams had opened was narrow and under fire. German forces counterattacked it repeatedly over the following days, trying to close it again. The 101st kept fighting inside Bastogne. The 4th Armored kept fighting to widen the opening. It took until January 8th before the Bastogne area was finally secured and the German encirclement was completely broken. By that point, American forces had been fighting in the Ardennes for more than 3 weeks, in the worst winter conditions Europe had seen in decades. The final accounting for the Battle of the Bulge as a whole was 75,000 American casualties. The 101st Airborne Division alone lost approximately 3,000 men killed, wounded, or missing during the siege and its aftermath. The German offensive that had been designed to split the Allied line and reach Antwerp never came close to its objectives. The cost of finding out was paid by the men who were in those Belgian foxholes in December 1944. The men who were inside Bastogne during those 8 days came back different. Some of them could not eat a full meal for days after the relief without becoming sick, because their bodies had adjusted to so little for so long. Some of them had frostbites severe enough to cost them fingers or toes. Some of them had wounds that had been inadequately treated in the aid station because the supplies had run out before the surgeon could do more than bandage and hope. They came back to the rear areas, and they ate and they slept, and some of them could not remember the faces of the men they had buried in the frozen ground of the Ardennes, and some of them could not forget them. They remember the cold in the foxholes before dawn, the kind of cold that went through every layer and settled into the bones. They remember eating the last of what they had, and not knowing when more was coming. They remember the sound of German tanks in the fog outside the perimeter, and not being certain the line would hold. They remember December 26th, the sound of American engines coming from the south, and what it meant. We should not forget. Was your father or grandfather at Bastogne, with the 101st, or with Patton's Third Army? Tell us his name in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.